Welcome to Module 12 Overview. This module covers topics related to the Research, Methodology, and Performance Management Knowledge Domain, which encompasses 5.3% of the questions on the CRC exam. The information in this module is organized into two lessons. One, Programmatic Evaluation, Management, and Evidence-Based Practice, and two, Research Methods and Psychometric Concepts. The CRC exam includes two major sections, Rehabilitation and Disability and Counseling. The learning objectives are organized based on this structure. Rehabilitation and Disability. By the completion of this module, students will be able to summarize program evaluation procedures used to evaluate the effectiveness of rehabilitation services and outcomes. Counseling. By the completion of this module, students will be able to describe and analyze statistics and psychometric concepts related to measurement, list and describe research methods and associated data analysis techniques, evaluate research literature associated with evidence-based practices, describe concepts and principles of organizational development and stakeholder management. The learning objectives and topics covered were generated based on information provided on the CRCC website. Module 12.1, Programmatic Evaluation, Management, and Evidence-Based Practice. Topics covered in this review are Rehabilitation Program Evaluation and Management, Research Literature and Evidence-Based Practices, and Conducting a Literature Review or Meta-Analysis. Rehabilitation Program Evaluation and Management. Evaluating a rehabilitation program is an essential component of ensuring that clients will progress toward their recovery goals. Personality, environment, and disability-related factors may all influence the extent to which a client is a good fit for a specific program, so it is important to evaluate the impact a program is having on a client. Programmatic evaluations can also impact the rehabilitation program itself to help identify who the program is best suited for and how the program can better serve a diverse body of clients. This module focuses on how data can be used to impact rehabilitation practices as well as how data is collected and evaluated. Programmatic evaluations are systematic, which means that data are collected in a scientific and intentional manner with the goal of describing what was impactful or non-impactful as part of a program. Most evaluations are not conducted with the goal of generalizing the findings to a larger body of clients, but rather to report a specific circumstance where some of the results may transfer to other related circumstances. Assessments that exist within a programmatic evaluation are often labeled as either formative or summative. Formative assessment focuses on collecting data in a manner that provides more immediate feedback during the program or as part of the development process of a program. Summative assessment focuses on collecting data that is used to make judgments about the impact of a program at its conclusion. Models of evaluation. There are several evidence-based models that rehabilitation counselors and researchers can use to evaluate a program's effectiveness. Here is a list of some of these models. A logic model. The goal of the logic model is to provide a framework to help evaluators assess the assumptions and theories used to guide a program and identify potential areas for improvement using data as evidence. There are multiple versions of the logic model, but most models focus on four major steps. 1. Identify the audience, situational factors, and resources needed for the program. 2. Identify the interventions, treatments, or evidence-based strategies necessary for the program. 3. Identify what outputs may be needed to measure and how that data can be collected. Identify the outcomes of the program as a result of the data collected. Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. Reaction is level 1. The evaluator collects data to measure the client reaction to the program using interviews, questionnaires, etc. Learning is level 2. The evaluator collects data that assesses the knowledge and skills the client has developed as part of the program. Behavior is level 3. The evaluator collects data to assess whether the client's intended behavior has changed as a result of the program. And results is level 4. The evaluator assesses the impact of the program by comparing the outcomes from the data to the goals of the program. Brinkerhoff's 6 stages of evaluation. Stage 1, the rehabilitation counselor conducts a needs analysis to identify what goals or focus should be identified for the program. Stage 2, the rehabilitation counselors create a plan and design for the program that meets the goals identified in the needs analysis. Stage 3, the client engages in the program and the rehabilitation counselor evaluates how the client is developing throughout the program. Stage 4, the rehabilitation counselor evaluates the knowledge and skills that the client has learned as part of the program. Stage 5, the rehabilitation counselor evaluates the behavior changes exhibited by the client as part of the program. Stage 6, the rehabilitation counselor evaluates the influence and payoff exhibited by the client as a result of the program. Managing and budgeting for rehabilitation programs. For a rehabilitation counseling program to be effective and have a long-term impact on clients, it must be efficiently and effectively managed by both the staff and leadership. This means that a program should have clear and explicit goals with adequate accountability that the program interventions are meeting the goals. Leadership and staff members that administer the services and treatments within a program need adequate training and credentialing when appropriate, as they must follow all relevant laws and regulations. Managing a program also means operationalizing a budget without going into debt. Balancing the budget means considering all costs associated with the program, including the wages and benefits of all of the employees, routine costs, building costs, assistive equipment, and any necessary future upgrades. Financial support for these costs usually comes in the form of Medicare, Medicaid, grants, or the client may pay the cost directly. Research literature and evidence-based practices. Some who specialize in rehabilitation counseling may choose to engage in research. Research is a systematic process that employs aspects of the scientific methods as part of the process of developing and evaluating programs, practices, treatments, and strategies in rehabilitation counseling. This process includes developing research questions, designing a study, collecting data, analyzing that data, and making conclusions. When research is conducted in a systematic manner using good research-based methods and analysis techniques, we consider the resulting interventions and treatments to be evidence-based practices, or EBP. A breadth of research literature exists that uses systematic methods to carefully and intentionally evaluate programs, strategies, treatments, and practices in rehabilitation counseling. Visit the module page online to find a list of websites to navigate to some of the most popular rehabilitation counseling journals. These include Counseling and Values, Spirituality, Ethics, and Religion in Counseling, the Journal of Addictions and Offending Counseling, the Journal of Applied Rehabilitation Counseling, the Journal of Counseling and Development, the Journal of Employment Counseling, the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development, the Journal of Rehabilitation, the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation, Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin, and Rehabilitation Research, Policy, and Education. In addition to reading individual journals, a rehabilitation counselor or researcher may choose to search for specific information in a variety of research-based databases. Some popular databases include Cochrane Library. The Cochrane Library includes several databases focused on health-related evidence-based practices and decision-making. The databases in Cochrane Library include the Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews, CDSR, the Cochrane Central Register of Controlled Trials, Central, and the Cochrane Clinical Answers, CCA. PubMed. PubMed is a collection of databases that provide information related to biomedical and life science research-based literature. PubMed is maintained by the National Center for Biotechnology Information, NCBI, and the U.S. National Library of Medicine, NLM, and is hosted by the National Institutes of Health, NIH. The PubMed database provides citation information, abstracts, and links to specific journal articles when they are available. PsycInfo. This is a database provided by the American Psychological Association focused on behavior and social science research. The PsycInfo database does not provide the links to journal articles themselves, but does provide abstracts and citation information. Conducting a literature review or meta-analysis. Literature reviews and meta-analyses are a great resource for rehabilitation counselors to use to identify evidence-based practices in rehabilitation treatment plans and programs. Systematic literature reviews. A systematic literature review, SLR, is a comprehensive appraisal of the research literature focused around a specific research question or topic. The goal of an SLR is to evaluate the rigor of the research literature used in the SLR and choose studies based on clearly defined criteria. A well-conducted SLR will have a transparent and well-defined process for finding and evaluating relevant literature. The result of the SLR is a summary of the implications described in the research literature. Narrative literature reviews. A narrative literature review tells a story based on the results and implications suggested in the research literature surrounding a specific content or topic areas. One may find a narrative literature review in a single article or as the introduction to another study. Scoping literature reviews. A scoping literature review focuses on identifying the range and scope of the body of evidence that exists surrounding a specific topic. These literature reviews often focus on the gaps that exist in the literature and suggest where future studies should focus their efforts. Meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a systematic summary of the research literature into a single narrative. A meta-analysis will calculate the overall effect size of a specific research question, topic, or intervention by compiling all the results from previous studies and using statistical methods to merge the results. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses are great sources for identifying evidence-based practices that are well-founded in the literature. However, rehabilitation counselors may use various sources for identifying evidence-based practices. The hierarchy of evidence model, which defines the quality of evidence from level 1, most robust, to level 6, which is acceptable but least robust. Level 1 is using systematic analyses or meta-analyses that summarize randomized controlled trials to identify evidence-based practices. Level 2 is using information from a single research study that uses randomized controlled trials as part of the methods. Level 3, using information from a single research study that does not use randomized controlled trials but still has robust research methods. Level 4 is using information from cohort studies that have robust methods and designs. Level 5 is using information from systematic literature reviews that focus on qualitative research or analyses that are mostly descriptive in nature. Level 6 is using information from a single qualitative research study or an analysis that is mostly descriptive in nature. And Level 7, using information obtained from experts in the topic area. There are several models that have been developed to provide recommendations for how to write research-related reports, systematic literature reviews, meta-analyses, or report research findings. Here's a list of some of these models. Visit the module page to click the links to learn more about each set of guidelines. PRISMA guidelines, which is the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. CONSORT, which is the Consolidated Standards for Reporting Trials. STROBE, which is Strengthening the Reporting for Observational Studies in Epidemiology. MOOSE, which is Meta-Analysis of Observational Studies in Epidemiologies. STARD, which is Standards for the Reporting of Diagnostic Accuracy Studies. And SPIRIT, Standard Protocol Items, Recommendations for Interventional Trials. Module 12.2, Research Methods and Psychometric Concepts. Topics covered in this review are research introduction, qualitative research methods, quantitative research methods, and psychometric concepts. Research introduction. Rehabilitation counselors may find themselves either engaging in research or using the research literature to learn about and implement evidence-based practices. As a result, it is important for rehabilitation counselors to understand some of the most important research methods, analysis tools, and terminology associated with the research literature. Some rehabilitation counselors may also find themselves in positions where they need to evaluate a treatment program, and in these cases, it is also important to use good research practices. Research studies are often categorized as one of two types: basic research, which focuses on the need to expand a knowledge base or explore an area for the sake of advancing knowledge, or applied research, which focuses on solving a specific or practical problem and often uses information learned from basic research. Qualitative research methods. Qualitative research focuses on research questions that are highly exploratory and/or in-depth. Qualitative data is usually language-based or collected by observing human behavior. The following is a list of common methods used to collect qualitative data. Interviews. Interviews often include a set of questions and/or engaging in a conversation with a research participant in a one-on-one setting. Interviews can be conducted in a few different ways. Structured interviews. Each participant is asked the same questions during the interview, and the questions are determined in advance. Semi-structured interviews. Each participant is asked the same questions, and the questions are carefully determined in advance, but the researcher may choose to ask additional or follow-up questions depending on the conversation that occurs during the specific interview. Unstructured interviews. Each participant is asked questions determined during the interview, depending on the specific conversation that occurs between the researcher and participant. Focus groups. Focus groups are interviews that occur across a group of research participants. The researcher often asks the group a set of questions, but the researcher also facilitates conversation that occurs between the research participants. The conversation between the research participants can add an extra level of interest and depth to a qualitative analysis. Observations. Analyzing qualitative data can often be very time-consuming. As a result, qualitative researchers usually only collect data from a small number of participants, and data is collected until the researcher starts seeing similar patterns in the results. This is called reaching saturation. As a result, researchers usually consider qualitative results to be transferable to other similar circumstances rather than generalizable to a larger population. Participants are chosen for the research study in a very purposeful manner that is consistent with the research question or questions identified by the researcher. There are multiple approaches to qualitative research. Ethnography. Researchers engaging in ethnography will have the goal of in-depth and descriptively identifying patterns among a group of people based on the culture and shared experiences within that group. Grounded theory. Researchers engaging in grounded theory will conduct an analysis from the ground up, which means the goal is to build theory from a set of data. Narrative. Researchers engaging in narrative research usually collect data about participants' lived experiences through their stories or stories told by others. Phenomenology. Researchers engaging in phenomenology have the goal of descriptively understanding the lived experiences of the participants. The lived experience may mean many things, but it usually means the interactions, environment, behaviors, and/or beliefs of the participants. Consensual qualitative research. Researchers engaging in consensual qualitative research, CQR, study the beliefs, experiences, and feelings of research participants that cannot be otherwise observed. The researcher who engages in qualitative research is fundamental to the results because patterns, themes, and/or categories identified during analysis are determined by the researcher. Because the researcher is so deeply ingrained in the analysis, it is important for the researcher to deeply understand their own beliefs, viewpoints, and assumptions that may influence the research. Expectations or biases could affect how the researcher asks questions in an interview or perceives behaviors in an observation. Similarly, the act of interviewing or observing a participant could affect the participant's responses or behaviors. All of this should be considered as part of the research design. Credibility is a qualitative research term that focuses on the accuracy of the data and its interpretation. Dependability is a qualitative research term that focuses on the consistency of the data and results obtained in a study. Transferability is a qualitative research term that focuses on the degree to which the results of a study can be transferred or used in a different context or setting. Quantitative research methods. Quantitative data generally exists as 4 possible types: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Nominal data exists in the form of categories or discrete values. As an example, identifying someone's race or ethnicity would be an example of a nominal variable. Ordinal data exists in the form of ordered categories. If you have ever taken a survey that has asked you to respond on a scale with the values strongly disagree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree, i.e., this is called a Likert scale, then you have experience with ordinal scales. Here the choices are categories, but one could argue that they are ordered categories where both sides of the scale, i.e., strongly disagree to strongly agree, are on opposite ends of a spectrum. Interval data is numeric, and each value is equally spaced from the next. As an example, temperature in degrees Fahrenheit is interval level data. In this example, 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 degrees Fahrenheit are exactly 10 degrees apart, just like 20 degrees Fahrenheit and 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Essentially, all values in the scale are equally spaced. Interval data does not have a true zero. As an example, 0 degrees Fahrenheit does not actually mean there is an absence of temperature because the scale continues in the negative direction. It can be colder than 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Ratio data is numeric and equally spaced, but also has a true 0 point that represents an absence. Measuring length in centimeters is an example of a ratio variable because 0 centimeter means the absence of length. Also, 5 centimeters is exactly 1 centimeter away from 6 centimeters, just like 12 centimeters is from 13 centimeters, i.e. they are equally spaced across the scale. Sampling. Sampling can exist in one of 2 forms, probability or non-probability sampling. Probability sampling focuses on selecting individuals or cases for a sample that are representative of a larger population. If the goal of the research is to generalize the results from a representative sample to a larger population, then it is important for researchers to use probability sampling methods. We will now discuss the different forms of probability sampling used in quantitative research. Random sampling involves picking participants or cases from a population completely at random. Cluster sampling involves randomly sampling from specific clusters of the population as identified by the conditions of the study. Stratified sampling involves dividing the population into subgroups and then sampling from each subgroup to the extent to which is necessary to best represent the population. Horizontal sampling involves sampling from individuals that all share a specific commonality. Descriptive statistics are used to summarize or describe a data set. We'll now discuss and understand the important descriptive statistic concepts and terms. Measures of central tendency. There are 3 measures of central tendency that describe where most of the data exists within a range of values. In a normal distribution, this would be considered the center of the data set. The mean, or the average, is calculated by adding up all the values and dividing the total number of values in the dataset. The median is determined by sorting all the data from highest to lowest and identifying the middle data value. The mode is the value in the dataset that exists most frequently. Measures of variability provide information about the spread of data. There are multiple ways to summarize the variability, but the three common measures are the range, variance, and standard deviation. Range is the difference between the highest and lowest value in the dataset. The variance is how far the data spreads out around the mean and is calculated by 1, taking the difference between each value in the data and the mean, 2, adding those values together, 3, dividing the total number of data points, and 4, squaring the result. Standard deviation. The standard deviation is, like the variance, a measure of how far the data spreads out around the mean, but the standard deviation value is easier to compare to the mean. The standard deviation is calculated by taking the square root of the variance. The distribution. A normal distribution is a mathematically based probability distribution, also known as a Gaussian distribution or a bell curve. A normal distribution is symmetrical, and in a perfectly normal distribution, the mean, median, and mode will all be the same value and exist at the center of the distribution. This means that a normal distribution will be divided into percentiles, where 68% of all scores in the distribution will exist within 1 standard deviation from the mean, 95% of all scores in the distribution will exist within 2 standard deviations from the mean, and 99% of all scores in the distribution will exist within 3 standard deviations from the mean. Research design. A major part of planning and conducting a quantitative study is to consider the design. An experimental design is a framework to help researchers appropriately control necessary variables so they don't influence the results erroneously. Explore the following terms which are necessary for understanding experimental designs. Independent variables. These variables do not change as part of the research study. Dependent variables can change as part of the research study and are influenced by the independent variables. Control group. This is a group of participants or cases in a research study that are not subjected to the intervention or treatment being tested. A control group is used as a comparison to the group that is subjected to the intervention or treatment, i.e. the experimental group. Experimental group. This group of participants or cases are subjected to the intervention or treatment being tested as part of the research study. An experimental group is usually compared to the control group, which is not subjected to the intervention or treatment. By doing this comparison, researchers can determine if the treatment or intervention is effective or not. Pre-test. This is an assessment given to participants in a study prior to the treatment or intervention. Usually, this data is used as a baseline to determine what knowledge, beliefs, or behaviors a research participant has before they are subjected to the intervention. Post-test. This is an assessment given to participants in a study after the participants have been subjected to the treatment or intervention. Usually, this data is used to determine the extent of the knowledge, beliefs, or behaviors exhibited by the research participants after they have engaged in an intervention. Parsimony is the concept that the simplest possible model is the best explanation for a phenomenon. In an experimental design, an experimental group is often compared to a control group with the intention of using that comparison to determine if an intervention was effective. If the experimental group performs better on an assessment of the desired knowledge, skills, or behaviors than the control group, which was not subjected to the intervention, then we assume that the intervention was effective. It is important to consider any variables called confounding variables that may influence the independent or dependent variables in ways that are not expected or accounted for in the research design. In experimental designs, the confounding variables are controlled by randomizing which participants are subjected or not subjected to the intervention. This can be very difficult to do in the real world because it is impossible to force an individual to be subjected to a specific treatment or intervention, which means it can sometimes be impossible to randomize. There are several forms of experimental design that may be used by our researcher. Post-test only design. In this experimental design, the research participants are only given a post-test. The post-test is given after the intervention to the experimental group, and the control group receives the post-test at an equivalent time point. The independent variable is whether or not the participants engaged in the intervention, and the dependent variable is how they performed on the post-test. Pre-test, post-test design. In this experimental design, the research participants are given both a pre-test and a post-test. The pre-test and post-test are given to the experimental group participants before and after the intervention, respectively. The control group also receives the pre-test and post-test at equivalent time points. The independent variable is whether or not the participants engaged in the treatment, and the dependent variables include the pre-test and post-test. Hence, the assessment scores can be compared both before and after the intervention, as well as across experimental and control groups. Solomon's four-group design. This experimental design takes into account the effect that the pretest has on the outcome of the participants. The research participants are randomly divided into four groups. Group 1 receives the intervention treatment as well as both a pretest and a post-test. Group 2 does not receive the intervention or treatment but receives both a pretest and a post-test. Group 3 receives the intervention or treatment and only a post-test but no pretest. Group 4 does not receive the intervention and treatment and only receives a post-test, no pretest. Here, researchers can compare whether the intervention or treatment is effective and whether the pretest influenced the participants' responses or behaviors. The downside of this experimental design is that it is complex and requires an in-depth statistical analysis. Repeated measures design. In a repeated measures design, also known as within subjects design, all participants receive both the intervention as well as the control conditions. In this experimental design, the participants are assessed before and after each condition. The order in which subjects receive the intervention and control conditions may influence the results. Therefore, some researchers will counterbalance the study by splitting the group in half and switching the order that the intervention and control conditions are given to the participants. Latin square design. All participants receive all intervention and control conditions. The order effects of the intervention and control conditions are considered by splitting the participants into groups where each group receives a different permutation in the order of the interventions. Factorial design. These experimental designs have more than one independent variable. Single-blind experimental design. In a single-blind experimental design, the research participants are not made aware of whether they are in the intervention or control groups. Double-blind experimental design. In a double-blind experimental design, the research participants and the researchers are not made aware of whether the participants are in the intervention or control groups. Other research designs exist beyond experimental designs. Quasi-experimental design. A quasi-experimental design is similar to experimental designs, except the confounding variables are not controlled through randomization. Quasi-experimental designs are much easier to use in the real world because it may not always be possible to force individuals into the intervention or control groups. However, these designs may be criticized because confounding variables may influence the dependent variable in the study. Single case design. In a single case design, a single research participant engages in both the intervention as well as the control. Here, the participant is assessed using a pretest, which acts as an initial baseline. Then the participant is subjected to the intervention and assessed again. Finally, the intervention is removed and another baseline assessment is measured. Developmental research design. These research designs are used to make comparisons over time. A cross-sectional design compares different groups of individuals who exist at different stages, but all of the data is collected at the same time point. As an example, a cross-sectional design may be used to compare first-year, sophomore, junior, and senior high school students' performance on a standardized exam. Here, each separate class of students would be assessed at the same time point, and the scores would be compared across each group to evaluate how knowledge develops throughout high school. A longitudinal design compares the same group of individuals at different time points. As an example, a longitudinal study design may be used to evaluate how the class of 2024's knowledge develops throughout high school. Here, the standardized exam would be given to the students as first-year students in 2021, as sophomores in 2022, as juniors in 2023, and as seniors in 2024. Then the results would be compared across each time point. Inferential statistics. Inferential statistics include a collection of statistical tests with the goal of generalizing the results of a sample to a larger population. A sample is usually collected because collecting data and gaining access to an entire population can be expensive, time-consuming, and sometimes impossible. Now we will discuss terms associated with inferential tests. Null hypothesis. The null hypothesis assumes that the means on an assessment from two or more groups are the same. This hypothesis is tested when engaging in hypothesis testing, such as t-tests or ANOVAs. A value known as a p-value is used to evaluate the null hypothesis. If the p-value is less than a specific threshold, many fields use 0.05 as the threshold or alpha value, then the researcher can conclude that the null hypothesis is incorrect and the means are different from each other, i.e., there is a statistically significant result. The alternative hypothesis or research hypothesis is the opposite of the null hypothesis and assumes that the means on an assessment of two or more groups are different from each other. Type 1 error means to reject the null hypothesis or assume it is incorrect when it is actually true. The type 1 error probability is dependent on the alpha threshold chosen. A type 2 error means to fail to reject the null hypothesis, assume it is true, when it's actually false. A t-test is an inferential test with the goal of comparing the means of an assessment between two groups or across two time periods. An ANOVA is an inferential test with the goal of comparing the means of an assessment across more than two groups and/or time periods. An ANOVA can compare within groups, compare means across time periods within the same research participants, or between groups, compare means across different groups. Effect size. In hypothesis testing, the p-value can tell a researcher if there is a significant difference between means, but not how much of a difference exists. An effect size describes the magnitude of the difference in the means, i.e., whether the difference is small, medium, or large. This is particularly important when the sample size is very large. P-values tend to decrease with increasing sample sizes, and therefore a researcher should also calculate an effect size coefficient, like Cohen's d, to determine if the difference between the means is meaningful. A Cohen's d value less than 0.20 is considered to be a small difference. Halo effect. The halo effect is when a researcher's biases or personal impressions unintentionally influence the way data is collected or analyzed. Placebo. A placebo is a false treatment or substance given to an individual which has no effect on the individual. The Hawthorne effect is when an individual unintentionally reacts in a specified way, even though they are given a placebo which should not have an effect. The Hawthorne effect can have a significant impact on research results and should be carefully considered by the researcher. Relationships between variables. There are several statistics that focus on the relationships between variables. The Pearson Product Moment Correlation Coefficient, or R, is a statistic that evaluates the magnitude of the linear relationship between two variables. The R value exists between -1 to +1, where a value of 0.0 means there is no linear relationship between the variables. A large negative value means there is an inverse relationship between variables. As one increases, the other decreases. And a large positive value means there is a direct relationship between the variables. As one increases, so does the other variable, or vice versa. Multiple regression. Multiple linear regression is a statistical technique that focuses on the extent to which a set of independent variables influence a dependent variable. A squared multiple correlation coefficient, R squared, is determined, and it identifies the magnitude to which an independent variable influences the dependent variable. Structural equation modeling. Structural equation modeling, or SEM, is a broad name to describe a collection of techniques that model the relationship between measured variables, e.g., items on a survey, and latent constructs, broad and measurable ideas that are assumed to be measured by the measured variables. In SEM, the researcher identifies a model for how the variables relate to each other and evaluates the extent to which the hypothesized model fits the data. Psychometric concepts. Psychometrics is a field focused on the testing, measurement, and assessment development. Validity and reliability are two important psychometric concepts because they refer to the extent of the evidence for the accuracy and precision of data. Validity is the extent to which an assessment measures what it is intended to measure. Reliability refers to the degree of consistency in the data. If there is no evidence for the validity and reliability of data, then it is difficult to have faith in the results of a study. Now we will discuss the different forms of validity. Content validity refers to the degree to which the content on an assessment reflects what it is intended to measure. Construct validity refers to the degree to which the internal structure or latent constructs expected to be measured by the assessment are reflected in the data. Convergent validity refers to the degree to which the data from an assessment correlates with another variable that is expected to measure the same or very similar constructs. Discriminant validity refers to the degree to which data from an assessment does not correlate with another variable, assuming the data is not expected to correlate with the second variable. Face validity refers to the degree to which an assessment measures what it is expected to measure at face value. Predictive validity refers to the degree to which the data from an assessment predicts another variable it is expected to predict. Now we will discuss different forms of reliability. Internal consistency reliability refers to the degree of inter-item correlations among the items that are expected to correlate within an assessment. Statistical tools such as Chromebox Alpha are used to evaluate internal consistency reliability. Inter-rater reliability refers to the degree to which two or more separate raters will consistently rate a specific measure. As an example, if a researcher categorized a set of data into distinct categories using a rubric, then the researcher may ask another researcher to do the same. Then the consistency of the categorizations across researchers is compared. Split half reliability. In this type of reliability, the researcher splits the data into halves at random. Then the degree to which the data halves correlate with each other is evaluated. Test-retest reliability refers to the degree to which an assessment produces consistent data over time. As an example, an assessment may be given to research participants at one time point and then again 2 weeks later, with no intervention in between. Since there is no expected reason for the participants to respond differently, It is expected that the results in both situations are similar.